And now we're going to be looking at the Harding and Coolidge presidencies. And so we start by looking at the 1920 election. Uh, Woodrow Wilson, as he came into the 1920 election, the Republican Party was very eager to try to win back the White House. After Wilson, of course, had won the election of 1912 and then won re-election in 1916. So Warren G. Harding really kind of emerges. Early on, he's not the leading candidate, but his message of a return to normalcy really began to appeal to voters. And what that meant was kind of a return to the normal life that people had enjoyed prior to the First World War. So, he kind of talks about this return to normalcy, and that message, it really kind of hits home with voters, and it helps him to win the 1920 election. In fact, he defeats James Cox of Ohio by a pretty large majority, takes about 60% of the vote. And so Harding comes into the White House with a core set of beliefs. He had grown up in Marion, Ohio, where people believed in taking care of one another. And so that kind of helped to shape his view. He really believed in not having much government intervention. And he really believed in small government, something that becomes kind of a basic tenet of the Republican Party in the 20th century and even beyond. So Harding was elected initially as a U.S. Senator from Ohio in 1914, but he actually skipped more sessions than he attended during that time frame. And he missed some of the historic debates on prohibition and on the 19th Amendment, or on the women's right to vote. As president, Harding regarded the job as being largely above his skills, and he'd even kind of confided in some of his friends that he really didn't feel that that the job was within his skills, but he felt the job was largely ceremonial. And his friendly backslapping manner and his avoidance of taking a hard stance on issues made it really hard for people to attack him and kept him pretty popular. So during his presidency, his answer to the post-war economic troubles was less government and business and more business and government, meaning he wanted to really try to keep the government out of the business, but try to keep the government getting more done. And so he sought to cut the federal budget and reduce taxes for wealthy Americans, believing that the wealthy would start businesses and pull America out of the hard times. Harding offered little to farmers, although he did sign the Ford-Macomber tariff, which raised the cost of foreign farm products. Now, we'll be looking at that later, and unfortunately, while that was intended to help farmers and he did sign it, it kind of had an adverse effect. The tariff raised the prices of American products, but raised the prices for American farm products, helping U.S. farmers in the short term, but it made it even harder for European markets to be able to afford the American products. And so that ultimately hurt our farmers there. And it also made it harder for the European countries to pay back their debts, which hurt us because they owed us a lot of money. And the tariff was the only measure that Harding took to help American agriculture. Now, another thing that happens during Harding's administration is a major scandal. Really, Harding compensated for his poor governing skills by hiring highly skilled cabinet members. For example, U.S. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon reformed the tax system, and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes and Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover were also incredibly successful cabinet members. Some cabinet members, however, were old friends from Ohio called the Ohio Gang, and they were later convicted for taking bribes. And then another big scandal. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was convicted and jailed for accepting bribes to allow oil companies to drill on federal reserves on government-owned property, government land that was called the Teapot Dome in Wyoming. And so, this whole scandal really kind of rocks his administration. So, distressed by the rumors, Harding took a trip to Alaska and he collapsed while giving a speech in Seattle. And he died not too long after. Harding's popularity was high when he died, but his own failings and the corruption of his administration soured his reputation over time. So, with Harding's death, Calvin Coolidge becomes president. Coolidge was raised in a modest rural Vermont home. His father ran a store and liked politics. He graduated from Amherst College in Massachusetts and took up law and politics in the Republican Party. He was elected governor of Massachusetts and gained fame for stopping the Boston police strike in 1919. Serious and straightforward, he was known as Silent Cal. And he liked playing practical jokes on the White House staff, but he hated small talk. As president, he got rid of officials that were suspected of corruption under Harding. He thought that business helps society and government should be limited. He lowered taxes, reduced federal spending, and would not help farmers or war veterans. He was popular at the time, but he did not run for re-election in 1928. At the same time, we also had some lingering effects left over from World War I. During World War I, European nations had borrowed more than $10 billion from the United States. Americans expected that Europe would repay the money back when the fighting ended, but this proved to be difficult. The Ford-McCumber tariff made it hard for European farmers to sell their goods to the U.S., and they could not earn the debt money that they needed to repay us. So instead, they turned to Germany, demanding an increase in reparation payments from Germany, which already the reparation payments they expected Germany to pay was much higher than Germany could afford. So to solve this problem, the United States lent money to Germany so that Germany could repay or make its reparation payments, and then in turn, those European countries could pay back the United States for what they owed us. Another thing that happened during this time frame was Brigadier General Billy Mitchell argued that the U.S. should invest more in building its air power. Mitchell commanded the U.S. air combat operations in World War I, and he firmly believed in the military potential of aircraft, so he conducted tests using planes to sink 2 battleships, but other military officials weren't convinced. Mitchell's confrontational style hurt him, and he was eventually punished for saying that the military had an almost treasonable administration of national defense. He left the military and continued to promote air power until his death in the 1930s. Another attempt to try to keep the peace and to try to reduce the building up of massive navies was taken place at the Washington Naval Conference. Peacetime brought pressure to reduce the size of U.S. armaments and to save money and reduce war threats. People feared that the world naval powers, including Great Britain and Japan, were in an arms race. So, hoping to stop the arms race, the U.S. organized the Washington Naval Conference and included all major naval powers. Countries agreed to cut back the size of their navies and scrapped existing ships and some that were under construction. The conference also led to an agreement on several issues threatening world peace, including plans to avoid competition among the world military powers for control of China. Many Americans thought the conference was a success, including the Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes. And another step that was taken was the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Though the U.S. refused to join the League of Nations, a strong interest in preventing war remained. The French proposed a treaty with the United States outlawing war between the two nations. We responded with an even bigger idea. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg proposed an agreement that would involve many countries. The Kellogg-Briand Pact resulted, stating that all countries who signed it renounced war as a solution for international controversies. The pact presented a high ideal for a war-torn world, and more than 60 nations signed on. Yet the pact had no system of enforcement, only the nations' promises, and soon the world would realize that it was not enough to stop war from happening, as of course we would soon be back in another world war.